Well, it's good to see you guys tonight. Hope you guys are having a good Wednesday and that your day has been filled knowing the Lord's presence with you all throughout the day. Glad you could be here tonight. If you're watching with us online, thank you for doing that. Thank you for tuning in. I'm not sure that's really quite the words to use, but hey, we're glad you're joining with us this evening as we continue our journey through the book of Revelation. We actually, the last 2 weeks, have gotten almost through whole chapters in 1 week, and we're going to try to do the same thing again tonight. We are in Revelation 18, and this does travel with chapter 17, which we looked at last week. Tonight, though, will be Revelation 18, and as you turn there, whether you're online or with us here in the room, let's take a few moments to pray before we get started. Heavenly Father, we are grateful for tonight. We're grateful for the opportunity to look into your word and to see the things that you have for us there. We pray that your Spirit would be present with us tonight, working within us to teach us and to show us the things that we need to know. The Lord would be strengthened and encouraged, that, Lord, you would give us the wisdom you talked about in this book as we read it, and that we would be comforted by the fact that you are sovereign, that you are Lord of the universe. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So just to remind you a little bit about what we've done the last couple of weeks in chapters 16 and then 17, and now as we get into 18. As we got to the end of chapter 16, we saw those bowls of wrath, God's judgment and wrath poured out upon the world. And as we got to 17 last week, and as we're at 18 today, 17 and 18 are not new events. They are looking at in more detail and more description of the bowls that were talked about there in chapter 16. We'll see even a little bit of that today. So chapter 16, the bowl judgments take place. Chapter 17 and 18 are essentially, like we've often had throughout Revelation, some events described on earth, and then a little step back and a little pause, or at least a little break to see what the heaven realities are, or what the vision or the perspective is from heaven on the events just described in the previous chapter. So that's what's happened. We've seen the bowls of chapter 16, chapter 17, and then this week, chapter 18, are looking back at those bowls and giving us a different perspective on it and even some more details on it, if you will. Because the bowls went pretty fast. If you remember, it's almost like the first chapter of Job. Bam, this happens. Bam, that happens. Bam, that happens. Bowl, and this massive stuff happens. So just in a matter of a few verses in chapter 16, we had essentially the entire world devastated and God's judgment brought to an end. So chapter 17 stepped back and gave us this picture of what God was doing from a spiritual point of view. In chapter 18, what we really have here as we approach 18 is, in some respects, kind of like the Book of Lamentations. Now, you may have, how many of you have read Lamentations in the last year? How many of you have read Lamentations ever? Okay. It's, honestly, I don't think I've preached more than once in my lifetime out of Lamentations, probably. It's not usually, you have the word lament in the title, and that's, of course, what Lamentations is. Lamentations in the Old Testament is a series of laments, a series of sorrows where Jeremiah is looking at what has happened in Jerusalem and just, torn up about it and is singing these laments, these songs. Well, Revelation 18 is a little bit of that. Now, in 18, we're not lamenting for anything that we're particularly fond of, because what's happened in chapter 17 is you have seen God's judgment poured out upon the woman named Babylon, and we looked a little bit at that last week. So we looked at chapter 17, we saw the woman Babylon seated upon the beast, and we saw that description. And Babylon, the woman Babylon, the great mother of harlots, as she's called there in chapter 17, verse 5, really stands for, or is the institutionalized world culture that's rebellious against God, that has promoted idolatry, that's promoted rebellion. And, in the Old Testament, those were represented mostly by the governments of Egypt and the nation of Babylon, and in the New Testament, Rome. And those three, in particular, in Bible times, would have represented a world culture and approach that would have been anti-God. So we know that, while those nations exist to a certain degree today, they don't exist as they did back then as far as there being these world national empires. But they're waves, they're precursors, if you will, to what will ultimately be that final world institution. And so this chapter 17 was that world, that Babylon, that culture, that institutionalized government culture, world culture that is anti-God, that's idolatrous, that's also violent, especially towards the people of God, that is destroyed. That's what's taking place in chapter 17. And all that's getting ready to happen. Chapter 18 is it's almost a series of funeral dirges and laments over the destruction of Babylon. So that's kind of the setting here. There's a couple of other things going on, but that's the main part of it. So chapter 18, we'll just begin reading in verse 1. After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illumined with his glory. He cried out with a mighty voice, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She's become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the passion of her immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins and receive her plagues. For her sins have piled up as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Pay her back even as she has paid, and give back to her double according to her deeds. In the cup which she has mix twice as much for her. To the degree that she glorified herself and lived sensuously, to the same degree give her torment and mourning. For she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, and I am not a widow, and will never see mourning. For this reason, in one day her plagues will come, pestilence and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire, for the Lord God who judges her is strong. And the kings of the earth who committed acts of immorality and lived sensuously with her will weep and lament over her when they see smoke of her burning, standing at a distance because of the fear of her torment, saying, Woe, woe, the great city Babylon, the strong city, for in 1 hour your judgments come, and the merchants of the earth weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Cargoes of gold and silver and precious stones and pearls and fine linen and purple and silk and scarlet and every kind of citron wood and every article of ivory and every article made from very costly wood and bronze and iron and marble and cinnamon and spice and incense and perfume and frankincense and wine and olive oil and fine flour and wheat and cattle and sheep and cargoes of horses and chariots and slaves and human lives. The fruit you long for is gone from you, and all things that were luxurious and splendid have passed away from you, and men will no longer find them. The merchants of these things who became rich from her will stand at a distance because of the fear for her torment, weeping and mourning, saying, Woe, woe, the great city. She was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. I'm not going to read all those things again. And verse 19. And they threw dust on their heads and were crying out, weeping and mourning, saying, Woe, woe, the great city, which all who had ships at sea became rich by her. Wealth, for in 1 hour she has been laid waste. So what we have here, we'll get to the end of it, is we have three groups of individuals lamenting or crying out woe, or almost a funeral dirge over the fate of Babylon. So let's work our way through this. The first three verses of this chapter are, as you noticed, an angelic appearance and an angelic pronouncement. There is in this echoes of Ezekiel chapter 43. Ezekiel 42, and we referenced this back earlier in Revelation when we had the temple measured. If you remember, we had this whole sequence several chapters ago about the heavenly temple being measured and sized up. And that's a call back to Ezekiel chapter 42 where the same thing happened. And in Ezekiel 42, the temple is measured out. God's proclaiming his ownership of the temple, and it belongs to him. That's part of that's going on there. And in chapter 43 of Ezekiel, after the temple has been reestablished and measured out, then a procession comes in and God's glory returns to the temple. That's the idea of what's going on in Ezekiel 42 and Ezekiel 43. And in Ezekiel 43, when the when God's returning to the temple, it says that the land was radiant with his glory. The terminology in Revelation 18 is really a direct callback, if you will, to Ezekiel chapter 43. And so we have this glory of God showing up to the temple, and it's described as lighting up the earth in the same way that the angel's glory here is lighting up the entire earth. So we have this idea that God's presence is on the way. God's glory is on the way. When God shows up, people take notice. It's obvious. So, and this fits in with a bigger picture here as we will be wrapping up these last few chapters in the next month or two. One of the themes will be God's reunified, or his presence now comes back again to be with his people the way he intended it to be. There's almost this idea, we talked about it last week, kind of a coming of full circle from Genesis to Revelation, where in Genesis the issue starts off in chapter 3 that because of humanity's sin, we are now separated from God's direct presence. So what you have from Genesis chapter 3 on is God's work to begin to restore that ultimately. And what we'll see ultimately in chapter 20, 19 and 20 at the end of Revelation, is that God's tabernacle, his dwelling place, once again is with humanity. He comes back in. His glory returns to them. The temple, the tabernacle, is re-inhabited. So this is a precursor to that here in chapter 18, verse 1. So the angel comes with the illumined glory and cries out, "Fallen is Babylon." So this is the destruction of that, not so much just an individual empire like the Roman Empire or literally the Babylonian Empire before, but it's that institutional system of rebellion against God, sanctioned immorality, hostility towards God's people, violence. And while there will, of course, not be an ancient Babylon necessarily at the end days, there will be that ultimate fulfillment. Egypt was a type of that, Babylon itself, Rome. These are all early precursors of what that ultimate fulfillment will be. There will be that final kingdom that does this. So the angel makes his pronouncement that Babylon is fallen and has become, it says, the dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. In other words, it's become a desolate place where only these creatures exist. If you're wondering about the birds, we're talking about things like vultures, essentially the types of birds that clean up dead things. You know, that's the picture here you have of a desolate, fallen city full of death. Verse 3, the reasons for her judgment are going to be repeated. We looked at this, chapter 17 talked about this. Chapter 18 again talks about this. The nations have drunk of the wine of the passion of her immorality. The kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her. And the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. We're going to see a couple of themes here. We've talked about this idea of immorality and the prostitution. This is a well-known theme in Old and New Testament, not dealing primarily with just the idea of literal sexual immorality, but really also throwing into the idea of idolatry, of worshiping and the people of God, people of this earth, turning from God and turning from being faithful to Him and turning to other gods. And that marriage prostitution picture in this image is pretty known throughout Scripture. So this is part of what's happening here, is that, again, the nations have turned away from God and been unfaithful to God and turned themselves to other things to worship or to adore. We're going to see that image throughout this chapter given as a reason for the judgment that's come upon Babylon, as well as the other thing that happens here, verse 3, we'll see it again, is this idea that the earth has become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. That is, there is this idea that there is, shall we say, rampant greed. That people's desire for stuff, their desire for money, their desire for wealth has become such that it overrides everything else. There is the pursuit of wealth, of material wealth. And because of that, they have turned away from God and have also, and we'll see this here in just a few moments, they have also been in the process of accumulating those great, vast amounts of wealth. They have been abusive towards, even violent towards those who have less. The Bible does speak to this quite a bit, by the way. Jesus spoke to it as well, that God does not look favorably on those with wealth and with influence and with power when they take advantage of and abuse those who do not have those things. We don't talk about that a whole lot. I don't know why. Maybe it's because the United States is the wealthiest country that's ever been on the face of the earth. So we don't want to talk about what God says about wealth. But one of the things, if you ever go back and read the Old Testament law that God set up through Moses, what you'll see is a number of laws that God instituted with Israel that deal with making sure that you don't have the rich oppressing the poor. How many of y'all have ever heard of the law of Jubilee in the Old Testament? Does anybody know what Jubilee is? Yeah. So the Jubilee, and there's a couple different permutations of that. The idea is that it was in Israel's code of laws given to them by God that there were things put in place to make sure there wasn't generational poverty. So, for example, let me just give you an example. Let's say a husband dies relatively young and leaves his wife without an heir, without a son. And she has no ability at that point in time, for whatever reason, to be able to make a go of it financially. So let's say what she does is she sells the land to pay off debts and have some money to live off of. But now, and what does she do? What does her family do in the long run to have wealth or to have a way to make a living over the long run once that money runs out? Well, if she does have descendants at some point, whether it's a daughter or a son later on down the line, Jubilee, every 50 years, whoever bought that land from her has to return it to that family, so that that family, once again, is not deprived of land, not deprived of the ability to have long-term generational means to support themselves. Now, it'd be a lie to say Israel did this very well. God chides them several times for not doing that. But there were multiple things in place in ancient Israel's laws to try to ensure that those who have the means don't oppress those who don't have means. And one of the things that Hosea and Habakkuk and Isaiah and Jeremiah and all these guys go after Israel's leaders for is that they aren't doing those things, that in fact the opposite's happening. So there's glimpses of that even here. That type of idea is given as reasons to judge Babylon, is the handling of wealth. One of the things that would take place in the Roman days as well. Obviously, Rome is the largest nation. It's essentially the world as we would understand it almost at that point in time. Rome is by far the wealthiest, most powerful nation on the planet at that point in time in history, first century A.D. And we've heard all the stories and the movies on the Roman army and the soldiers and all the innovations that Rome had militarily to conquer nations. But it was said even by the historians of the day of ancient Rome that Rome was as effective at conquering countries through economics as it was through military might. What they would do is they would control. They knew how to control the natural resources of the empire of that day and age. So they had food. They had grain and wheat coming from Egypt, and they had wine and olive oil coming from Spain, and but everything flowed through Rome. And it was a situation where if you have something they want, or you're on the boundaries of their nation, of their empire, they want this, what they can do is essentially strangle you out until you do what they want them to do. And they would use economics and resources to conquer nations almost as often as they actually did the military. And so when we see these merchants and sea merchants later on down the line, they're part of that system that Rome has been using to enforce loyalty. If I'm your only source of food, who do you love? If you're thirsty and I'm the one with a tap, I'm the one with water, and I say you have to like me, what do? You say you like me. You may not, but you have to say it. And if you tick me off, what happens to you? Yeah. So it's a very effective way of making sure that people are loyal when you're their source of food. Well, that's what's going on there. So the angel shows up. Verse 4, we hear another voice coming from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people." So this is a call to the people of God to leave or to separate themselves from Babylon, so they don't get the plagues upon them either. And again, this is as much a spiritual thing as it is an actual physical thing, because this is a worldwide system. So where in the world do you go when the whole world's this way? But this is referring to holiness, I believe. God's people are to be a unique, holy, separate people. Unique. This has a callback a little bit, if you will. Let's go back to Genesis, and you may think of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And do you remember a story where God was telling somebody who's in Sodom and Gomorrah, get out? And what did he do? He's kind of, what did Lot do when told to get out? Do I have to? And God says, not only will you get out, don't even look back at it. Don't have a wandering eye about it. Don't look back lovingly at it. Don't have a regret about it. And of course, Lot gets out, but who does what? His wife looks back, and she receives the plague that's going on for them. There is this idea here that God's calling his people out from that world system, and don't look back. Don't value the things this world's valuing. Don't make the same mistakes that the world has made and turning its back on who God is. And when Jesus says, store for yourselves treasures in heaven and not treasures on earth, there's a short-term immediate impact of that, but there's also an eternal impact of that, a long-term strategy here going on. So he tells the people to get out, the people of God to get out, to separate themselves. There are any number of scriptures. Ephesians 5:11, Jeremiah 50:8-9 has a call back to this. Revelation 21, we'll get to here in a few weeks. All these have this idea of God's people being separate. And we know this, right? We're to be holy because he is holy. We are people who belong to God. How many of you have had a chance to travel overseas? Very much. Okay. Callie, I know you've been all kinds of different places. When you travel overseas, are Americans identified easily? And why do Americans stick out? Not just we might look different in certain places of the world, but why do even the personality of Americans, what makes us stick out? Okay. On the negative side, we think the world revolves around us. And economically, it kind of does in some respects. I've heard any number of things in my own travels that sometimes Americans are a little bit arrogant and expect everybody to adapt to us. We don't adapt to them. Why should I learn your language? You have to learn my language. On the other hand, I've also seen Americans described as being a very optimistic, can-do type of thing, maybe more so than certain other cultures. Honestly, you can pick out Americans when you travel overseas. And I'm not just talking about places like Africa where we really stand out. But you can pick out Americans. We're just different. Much more so, our citizenship is ultimately where as believers? Yeah. Hey, I'm grateful to be an American. But my first citizenship is actually not here. It's in heaven. So by the same token, we should be a people distinct. That as we walk around and act and talk and do business and all those things that go along with life, there should be something about us that makes people go, you're not from around here, are you? And it won't be just the accent. I remember thinking, of the the earlier half of my life I lived in Arkansas and Texas, but I still didn't think I really had much of an accent. First time I went to Chicago. Where are you from? They didn't say it that way, but you're not from around here. You kind of get that thing going on. First time I was in that airport, Chicago, people kind of look at you like, okay, yeah, you're from down there somewhere, aren't you? Stick out. Yeah, Boston, yeah. Boston sticks out. Yeah, I like y'all. Y'all just flows off the tongue, not yous guys. So we digress, but you get the point. He calls them out. And in verse 5 it says, again, Babylon, her sins have piled up as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. When you think of sins reaching to the skies, is there any other stories that come to mind? The Tower of Babel. That's essentially the idea of the Tower of Babel, where God had given the people of in Noah's day and those following very specific instructions about what they were to do, and they essentially said, "I think we'll do the exact opposite." and the Tower of Babel, there's this idea that it was rising up in a way as to be a direct challenge to God, where it essentially and once it rises up to a certain point where they defy God to a certain point, God just says, "Okay, that's enough." Bam, and people scattered because God had told them to scatter, to fill the earth. And they said, "No, we'll just do this." So he scatters them anyway. So we have all this going on here. So this is all the justification, and then we see that what's coming, verse 6, 7, 8, we have what is coming kind of declared. Verse 7 in particular, again, you may see that the phrase, "I sit as a queen and I'm not a widow," this is actually a direct quote from Isaiah 47, where the exact same thing is said by the sinful Babylon, and basically saying, "I've got nothing to be afraid of. I'm in charge. I'm the queen. I rule. What are you going to do to me?" And God says, "Okay, well, let's talk." So a direct quote from that, a direct reference. Again, lots of stuff from Isaiah, lots of things going on there. So we have three groups here, beginning in verse 9, that are going to begin to sing laments or mourns over the fate of the great city, over the fate of Babylon. The first group is the kings of the earth. Now, you may remember that just in the previous chapter, the kings of the earth and the beast turn and actually make war on Babylon, the great city, the harlot. And we talked about that last week, but now here they are, they're mourning. So what's happening here? Well, again, there's lots of different pictures and metaphors going on here. What's happening ultimately, though, is this. Those who have, even if they've turned on that worldly system of idolatry and wealth that Babylon would have been pushing, they've still benefited from it. They've still based their lives upon it. They've gotten in bed with it, so to speak. And now that it's gone, they realize, oh, wait a minute. There went our food train. That was where we got all our money. That was what gave us power. So they had been in bed with her, and they're going to lament over her when they see the smoke of her burning. And they stand at a distance. In fact, we see all this. Every one of these groups are standing at a distance from the burning, smoldering heap that was Babylon. And why are they keeping their distance? They're trying not to get caught up in the smoke. Why else? Something's being set on fire. You try to get out of there. So the kings of the earth are distancing themselves, and they make note, verse 10, in 1 hour your judgment has come. They make note of the absolute speed with which they happened. We just talked there in verse 16, these bowls happen, and just from a literary point of view of them being talked about there in chapter 16, it's one verse, bowl this, everything wiped out. Next bowl, everything wiped out. Third bowl, more stuff just wiped out. All the water's wiped out. All the fish in the sea are wiped out. All the animal, boom, 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 bam, bam, bam. Well, the inclination here is, whether it's a literal hour or whether it's just, whatever it might be, it all happens quickly. And we've got a couple of our folks, right now. We were talking about this before we started this evening. We have a couple of our guys right now doing disaster relief in Louisiana. And what happens? Why are they down there? What happened? Well, the hurricane. How long does it take to lose everything? Doesn't take long, does it? Everything can be gone in no time. Whether it's through a hurricane, whether it's a fire, things can be gone in no time at all. And so they're looking at, and they're amazed that all this wealth, all this power, all this influence, everything is gone. Essentially, the idea is the most powerful system on earth is gone in a matter of hours. And they find themselves, the other powers that be surrounding them who've depended upon that are all of a sudden going, how did that happen? How did everything go away in a matter of an hour? Everything that we trusted, everything we relied on, everything that gave us our wealth, everything that gave us our power, it's gone. So the kings of the earth mourn. Secondly, in verse 11, the merchants mourn, the businessmen mourn, because now the world economy has been what? It's devastated. It's gone. And so, how do they make? Who's going to buy gold now? Now, this whole listing here in verse 12 and 13. This is it's kind of interesting. There are other extra biblical historical resources about the Roman Empire. There's just Roman history, and everything that's on this list is essentially in the top 25 things, historically speaking, that were the most expensive things to buy in Rome. This is the Macy's catalog list of ancient Rome. What's the store from Dallas that used to do all the big Christmas lists? It wasn't Macy's. It's does it start with the N, or is it Nordstrom's? Neiman Marcus. Okay, yeah. This is Neiman Marcus here. What's that? Yeah, but like Amazon for rich people. There's no discount. This isn't Walmart. Many of these things we know from Roman historians that some of these things in here are things, well, obviously gold and silver, precious stones. We understand that those are expensive. They're expensive today, but these are things that the wealthy bought. The things that are purple and red, satin. These are all imported items or rare items that only the elite, only the rich people afford. And so there is this idea going on here that the merchants are going, we have lost our luxurious markets. We've lost the high-ticket items. How are we going to survive without this? How are we going to survive without pearls and diamonds and gold? Or for these people, more importantly, how are we going to survive without selling them to people? We've made our money off of this. And if you're selling pearls and diamonds and fabric only to the extremely wealthy, are you getting wealthy yourself? Yeah. And in the process, are those who don't have those type of resources getting pinched out? Yes. The picture being painted here is of not just people working and making a good, honest living, but people who are, through greed and excess and luxury, really hurting others while gaining for themselves an absurd amount of wealth. That's the picture here. So we have this long list of things. Verse 14, the fruit you long for is gone from you. And we even see in verse 13, It even says slaves and human lives. The reality is there is a vital slave trade. It's estimated that in the Roman days of this time in history, roughly 20% of the people that lived in the Roman Empire were slaves. Now, slavery worked differently then than it did, say, in our own nation's history. Slaves at that point in time they would have come from captive soldiers in war. They may have come from, quite frankly, a parent who thinks they can't give their children the resources they need, so they would sell their child to someone who's got wealth to work for them as a way of taking care of the child. Kidnapping, perhaps. Indentured servitude, kind of use it to pay off your debts. It was sometimes criminals who were convicted of a crime might serve some time as a servant or a slave. Even that slave trade is being caught up in all this. Verse 15, the merchants of these things who became rich from her will stand at a distance because of the fear of torment and weeping and mourning, saying, woe is this. And so, verse 17, again, in 1 hour such great wealth has been laid waste. So, in a very short time, all the power and influence and authority is gone. And now we have a second group of people mourning the fact that all the wealth is gone just like that. Because gold and pearls and diamonds may be worth a lot of money, but how much does it do to keep you alive if you want to eat it? So you can't eat and drink it, can you? You can't plant in the ground and grow more of it. Doesn't really do much for you at that point in time. Verse 17, after that, it says, verse 17, part B, and every shipmaster and every passenger and sailor and as many as make their living by the sea stood at a distance and were crying out as they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, what city is like the great city? So we have the kings, we have the merchants, and now we have essentially the cargo. These are the, pardon me, Greg, this is the UPS of the day. The sea, how do things get from Egypt to Rome? By ships. How do things get from Spain to Palestine? I mean, they can go overseas, but, why would you do that? Why would you walk somewhere when you can take the train or drive a car? I mean, the Mediterranean is, the shipping industry is the lifeblood of all of the economy in Roman times. So they're looking at this and going, okay, the kings are upset because all the power is gone, and just like that, and the merchants are upset because all the money is gone, and as a result of all the cargo shippers are going, we got nothing to ship, and they're upset too. And you remember that when we had those bowls, what's being attacked? We talked about this. Not only is the land being attacked, but the seas are being attacked. Everything is getting shut down. So all these groups, and two of the three in particular, the shippers and the merchants, are being attacked on an economic level. We're talking about money here. All these things are being shut off or shut down, and they're singing these dirges, if you will. They end in verse 19 because of the fact that all this has been cut off from them. So everything's wiped out. And again, if you go back and read the bowls of chapter 16, this goes right in line with what we saw happens there. We're just talking about the same event. So everything's been destroyed, including the ability to feed, ship, the economy. Everything is just completely in upheaval, and nothing's there. And in the middle of all this, in verse 20, he says this: rejoice over her, heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her. Again, this is a thing we've talked about over and over in Revelation, that much of what takes place in Revelation, much of what God is doing in judgment against the world and its systems, is for those who have been, as a result of the prayers, or God has used the prayers of his people who have been murdered, who have been persecuted, who have been martyred, and this is God's response. It is the same as the people of Israel crying out in Egypt, how long, O Lord? And God showing up with Moses and plagues and say, now we got it done. It is Babylon coming in and overstepping its bounds as God's role as judgment in Israel, and taking advantage of the situation and abusing the people of God. And God said, okay, here comes your judgment. It's the same thing. And as surely as the Israelites would have rejoiced from being free from slavery, as surely as the people of God would have been rejoicing at the idea of Babylon being torn apart and them getting their freedom again, the picture here is of justice having been done. That all that's taking place has been earned and deserved by those who have openly turned their back on who God is, who have been unfaithful to Him, who have been immoral in that sense and turned from God to other gods, whether it's themselves or whatever else it might be. And because of that, in addition to the violence and the rejection of God's people, the murder, the martyrdom, all these things are taking place in these last days, that what takes place is deserved, is earned. And that justice is worth celebrating. This is not about revenge, it's about justice. So he says, rejoice, heaven and saints. God has pronounced judgment for you against her. You've won your case. Remember, chapter 6. How long, O Lord, will we be before we're vindicated? He says, rejoice. Here it is. You've been vindicated. You've won the case. You're now declared the victor. And so then, after that pronouncement of judgment and rejoicing, the strong angel takes up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea. And there are different sized millstones. The millstone is talking about here. If you don't know what a millstone is, this would have been used. It's a large rock used to grind grain into flour. And so you might think, remember when Samson was captured by the Philistines and had his eyes gouged out. He was chained to a millstone, and his job was to push this giant millstone that would have ground up the grain. Now there are small ones for a residential home use, for example, but there's the big ones that are used to produce stuff on a big scale. And these stones would have been sometimes a ton or two in weight. They're huge, solid pieces of round, chiseled rock, and they're massive, tons. That's what Samson was charged with turning. Well, that's the stone we're talking about here. So there's this giant millstone. This angel picks up this giant, tons heavy rock, if you will, and throws it into the sea. And it says, by this represents, this is the picture, if you will, of how Babylon will be destroyed. Not necessarily that it'll be destroyed by being thrown into the sea necessarily, but it's going to happen that fast. How fast does a big rock sink? Actually, small ones sink pretty fast too, but it's Now a flat piece of shale might sort of float a little bit, but yeah, if you're really going to skip in that rock, you're not going to skip a millstone. I'll say that. Probably technically, physically, you're right. Laws of physics are the same. In Jeremiah 51, there is a similar picture of God taking a millstone and throwing it into the ocean, throwing it into the water as a symbol of the coming judgment upon the enemies of God's people. So it's a picture. It's a prophetic picture. It's God saying, "You see this rock? That's going to be you." It's God, making a big picture. So this angel throws this millstone, and the result is the sound of harpists, musicians, flute players, trumpeters will not be heard any longer. No craftsman of any craft will be found in you any longer. The sound of the mill will not be heard in you any longer. The light of the lamp will not shine in you any longer. The voice of the bridegroom and the bride will not be heard any longer. Merchants or the great men of the earth. First of all these things are no longer there. Life as you know it is over. This is the destruction. This is the result of the bowls. When we saw all those bowls in chapter 16, everything's over. And this is just that descriptive way of describing all that took place in chapter 16 with those bowls. When the bowls show up, everything's over. And it happens just like that. I've mentioned this a couple times. Sword fights with God don't last long. Whatever battle of Armageddon, whatever defiance this world will have in arguing with God, that's not going to be some long, prolonged fight. It's going to be over quick. You know, when I was much younger and my sons were much younger, you know, if you got dads and you had a son, you get in the floor and you wrestle with them. And you're like 18 months old or 3 years old or 5 years old, whatever it is, you just get in the floor and you wrestle. It's fun. Those are fun memories for me even now as a dad to go back and remember, you know, wrestling on the floor with the boys when they were little. But there wasn't a real contest. You let them jump on you and oh no. You know. But when there's a real fight, that's not a contest. When God shows up, there's not a real battle to be had. It's over when God shows up. And the world sees this and goes, that was fast. And they're stunned by the absolute, complete, and utter destruction of everything that they have ever known. It's all gone. In an hour is the idiom here. It's all gone. And they're amazed by what they see, and there's no, real life is gone. And here's the last justification for it again, into verse 23. These last things stated again. Merchants, the great men of the earth, again, the power, that economic power, those who have great wealth controlling things and oppressing others. That's part of the issue. The nations were deceived by the sorcery of Babylon. That's not talking about magic. That's just the idea of deceiving, deception, pulling the wool over their eyes, and convincing the world that God is to be rejected. And then finally, of course, the blood of prophets and of saints and all who have been slain on the earth, the violence, especially the violence against God's people. All these things are listed at the end of the chapter for justification for the judgment that God has poured out upon Babylon the Great. So, what do we take out of that tonight? Not the most cheery of passages, unless you are the people of God whom God has said to do what in the middle of all this? Get out, yeah, get out, and then rejoice. So for us tonight, it's a reminder: don't be counted with the values and of the culture that we live in. Don't be caught up in the values of a world system that has denied and rejected God. If you're going to take your cues from somewhere, that's not where you take them from. And then secondly, that's probably going to result in some hardships, either short-term or long-term, but rejoice, because God will take care of things ultimately in the end. And when that happens, we will rejoice. All right. So next week, look at that. We got through another whole chapter again. 3 weeks in a row. You never thought that would happen, did you? So next week we will be in chapter 19. If you've been watching with us online tonight, I'm grateful you have been doing that. I want to invite you to be with us this coming Sunday morning as we resume our study in the book of Acts. We're in chapter 21. And more than that, it's also just a time to be with God's people, to rejoice, to sing, just to be with those who love us and that we can love. It's a good thing to be here Sunday, so I hope you will be here then. Y'all have a good evening. I hope you take some time to pray tonight as we do here, and we'll see you Sunday. All right. So I think most of you know, just as we pray,